In today's At Issue interview series, we're doing a discussion with Steve Hadley, who is a senior advisor for international affairs at the U.S. Institute of Peace and also a principal at Rice Hadley Gates, an international consulting firm. Steve was at the National Security Council twice and has spent a long career in government. We're talking with him today about the future of transatlantic relations and particularly the future of Europe. Steve Hadley, it's really good to have you at the Institute, and I hope it will be the beginning of a long discussion which we need to have about Europe, and I was hoping we could start here. You and I share something, and that is we've been dealing with policies across the oceans for 40 years. You've been in government so long. I've been working here in this field. And I have a feeling that shall I call them the tectonic plates of Europe and the United States may be moving in directions which we're not quite clear about. My feeling, and you were in government at the time when the wall came down and the euphoria that went on there, is that since those last, almost 23 years now, relations have moved in a direction which is not quite as comparable to the almost emotional relationship we had. Remember, we had millions of Americans in Germany all those years. We don't have that anymore. And let me ask this provocative question. Is it that we are moving in a more transactional relationship rather than what we had when the Cold War was at its apogee? I mean, what holds us together is the question I think that we need to always raise. And I'll throw in something I want to get to, and that is this whole NSA mudslinging contest that's going on, which I think is rather over the top. But where do you see things? I know your activities have moved in different directions all over the globe, and yet you know that Europe remains kind of a heartbeat of our connections and our partnerships. Where do you see the relationship going? Because I'm a little concerned about it.
I am too. I think that when the wall came down, and then probably for the next 10 or so years when there was some questions about the role of Central and Eastern Europe and the debates about NATO enlargement and getting the EU to finally turn its attention towards incorporating those states. I think really after that period of time, after the turn of the century, most Americans came to the conclusion that Europe's done. It's finished. The European project really is over. And I think...
As far as we're concerned.
As far as the United States is concerned.
Okay.
And while, of course, that began a process of soul-searching within Europe that continues to this day about whether Europe, in terms of EU, not EU, something in between, multiple speed EU kinds of approaches, that is, I think, an argument and a discussion that Americans never really understood, didn't really resonate, and didn't pay attention to. So when people talk about our relations Europe, I think most Americans will say, well, let's talk about our relations with the UK, with France, with Germany, with Italy, with Spain, and this whole momentous debate in Europe about the European project and where Europe is going. I think most Americans don't follow, don't understand, and even within the think tank community that you and I work in, there's a sense in which I think a lot of the expertise was nationally based, not about the European project. And I think a lot of think tanks almost are observers of what's going on in Europe. And the idea that America would be an observer of the European project, which we were such a part of and a champion of after World War II, I think tells you where the relationship has gone. I think there's some good news. I think the good news is that there has been, certainly in the Bush administration, and now I think a return to it in the Obama administration, this notion of values, and that people who share our values are our natural allies, and that in this world of chaos and uncertainty, when there are a lot of competing values that are not ours, either American or European, I think there's a little bit of a coming home. For Americans who say, well, who are the people in the world who share our values and who can be our natural colleagues and allies in sorting through all of this? And I think a lot of people are beginning to say, well, that's Europe. They share our values. They have enormous resources to diplomatic and economic, soft power, some hard power, resources to bring to bear. They're the ones who we ought to be talking to as we look to the issues of what do you do in China, what do you do in the Middle East, could we do together in Africa, which I think is an area of U.S.-European collaboration.
And quite frankly, here I think is where TTIP comes in as a kind of a poster child for re-sewing that relationship together. But what you're making the point, I think, is that we're not really talking, we're not worried about Europe per se. We're not worried about Germany anymore, which was, the front line of the Cold War. We're really talking about third, fourth, and fifth dimensions outside of Europe.
And I would say what Americans, I think the shift is beginning. Europe used to be a problem.
Right.
A place where we had to make an investment to ensure security. In many ways, Europe ceased being a problem. And what Americans, I think, are beginning to think is that Europe is an opportunity, a natural place because of shared values and shared interests where we can work together to deal with all these global
problems. Okay, but let me come back.
That, I think, is beginning to happen. It's not yet fulfilled.
Well, that's a good way to put it, because I was going to come back with a kind of a pushback on what you just said, because which Europe are we talking to? In other words, you said, and I think quite rightly, that Europe is a little ambiguous about what its next passage is. It's really come a long way. There's no question about it. It's a fantastic experiment. I think that's really not questioned. But the fact is that they're not quite clear. Where's the border of Europe? Turkey. What goes on next, and where are their capacities? And I think they're a little bit at odds with each other on that.
And I think that's partly because one of the problems of moving in the direction I've described, where Europe becomes an opportunity and a national ally, is a variant on Kissinger's thing. The question I think a lot of Americans have is, so who speaks for Europe?
Correct.
And there is now someone who is the CEO of Europe and a foreign policy spokesman, but they have not occupied the field.
Right.
So when people think of Europe, they still expect to see a picture of Merkel or Hollande or someone like that. And so one of the problems for the kind of engagement we would like to see between the United States and Europe is that Europe is sort of stuck in the middle of whether it is going to really still on the road to being a single political and economic entity, or is it actually going to regress to a situation where there are trade relations and the like, but in terms of political issues, foreign policy issues, it's basically still the sum of nation states. And I think the potential for a U.S.-European partnership will not be fulfilled until we know what kind of Europe we're dealing with.
Yeah.
And sure, a lot of progress has been made, but I think there are a lot of, to the extent Americans pay attention, they're asking the question, well, where is Europe going? A lot of discussion about, is the euro a godsend or a mistake? Is it going to survive or is it going to fracture? The Eurozone going to fracture? Those questions, I think, hang over U.S.-European collaboration in terms of the minds of American citizens, because they're not quite sure whether this European entity is for real and who's going to speak for it.
Okay, now you're at the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies, and that's why I want to ask you a little bit about Germany, because you just said something about when we look across the Atlantic, we see Cameron, we see Hollande, we see Merkel. Any question in your mind that Germany is the effective leader of Europe at this point? Or how would you define it?
I'm a big fan of Chancellor Merkel, and I think we, the world community, is lucky to have her. Second, I think the relationship, and it's something you asked about earlier, I remember a meeting when I worked at the Pentagon in 1991 between then Secretary of Defense Cheney and Helmut Kohl. And Kohl said, I'm worried about what is going to tie the United States and Germany together after your 365,000 troops largely go home. And he was right to worry, and he saw it, I think, sooner than most, and talked about a number of exchange programs that he wanted to get going in order to tie the two peoples together. And I think we've lost some ground there.
How so?
I think they lost some ground there. Well, if you look at where my daughters and their friends travel, it's not to Europe.
Right.
It's sort of all over the world to very exciting places, but not to Europe. And my older daughter's been to China many times, never been to Germany. I think that tells you something. You know, you can generalize sometimes a little bit from the specific. In terms of the chancellor, I think she is presiding over a Germany in transition. You know, this is still
And a Europe in transition.
A Europe in transition and a Germany in transition, both within Europe and within the global setting. And I remember there are many people who criticize, for example, the German deployment into Afghanistan. They were up north in Kunduz. It was a very quiet area. And people were sort of, you know, the fight is in the south. Where are the Germans? And I remember Chancellor Merkel making the point to President Bush, for Germany, for its history, as it finds its way in a role of leadership in Europe, given the historical background, and in the international community, we need to take it a step at a time. The international community is not ready. The German people are not ready. So let us work through this, you know, in an orderly, systematic way. And I think that process is still underway. And therefore, Germany does not look like the bold leader of Europe at this point, and it's not by accident, it's by design, because I think that the Chancellor's view probably is neither the German people nor Europe is ready for that.
I think you're absolutely right. I remember listening to Joschka Fischer once, who you know well, and he said, we'll lead, but we'll lead from the second row sometimes. The point being what you just made. I mean, I'm sure that that's going to be the transition mode. What would happen, for example, think about it for a second, if a German became head of the Commission, or a German, you know, became head of maybe took over the current foreign policy role? How would Europe react to that? You know, history runs deep. But nevertheless, it can't be denied that Germany's role de facto is clearly going to determine some of the next steps that are going to go on. I think, quite frankly, one of the questions that I wanted to get to was, how do we in Germany, we can interpose Europe here, but when we talked a little bit before about, really it's not about Europe, that's not a problem. The way I put that is that Germany and Europe itself, but Germany in particular, was once the object of American foreign policy, now it's the subject, meaning that we talk to Germany about those 4, 5, 6 dimensions. Where is it that we need Germany, would you say? I mean, we talk about Russia, where Germany has a particularly strong connection, which I think is now somewhat hazy at the moment in terms of what Putin's doing in Moscow. But where would you point to if you said, and I don't care if it's Germany in this point or Europe as a whole, where do we need them to deal with those 4, 5th, and 6th dimensions? What would you pick out?
I would say the first thing we need Germany to do is to lead to get the European identity sorted out, and to get this question resolved of what kind of Europe are we going to see going forward. That, I think, is the number one thing we need Germany to do. Second, I think it has been the case that there has been a lot of consultation. I know there was in the Bush administration, I hope there has been in the Obama administration, a lot of consultation with the Chancellor about Russia because of her own personal history. And that is a place where I think German-American collaboration can be very useful and very important, particularly since the relationship is in such stasis at the present time, as the recent events have shown. I think there are a lot of unexploited opportunities. Germany is huge in China in terms of trade. Europe is very important in terms of trade with China. But I think the strategic questions posed by Asia, the emergence of China, the management of that emergence, the helping to ensure that the relationship between China and Japan does not become a conflictual one, dealing with those territorial issues in the South China Sea and the East China Sea that could press the relationship in the direction of confrontation. Europe has not showed up in that debate, and I think they're very active on the commercial side. I would say they have been an performer on the strategic side. So I would like to see Germany and the United States talk about China and how they see China and how we might collaborate and how Europe might be a partner with the United States for thinking through this question about whether there can be a different kind of great power relationship as China emerges that does not result in the kind of conflict we've seen historically when a major power emerges on the world stage. Germany has a lot of history about that and how it can go wrong. And I think Germany and Europe ought to be in dialogue with the United States of how we can make this historic moment when Asia emerges and within Asia China emerges different from the history.
That's a very good point. I mean, as you speak, I was also thinking about Japan, because the noises that are going to come out of Tokyo at the moment also point in a direction where we have to pay close attention to where they want to go, because that's part of an enormously important triangle: China, Japan, Korea. It's interesting to note that after the Chinese election, one of the first visits to Europe was to Germany directly. They know.
They do.
And the presence of German economy, the economic presence is huge.
And that's a huge opportunity, and I would have hoped
Yeah.
that before that visit, the Chancellor and the President and their staffs were in dialogue about what is the agenda and what are the messages that ought to be sent, because it is evidence of the fact that Germany in particular and Europe in general has a role to play, and it should not be limited just to the economic. They should be carrying some of the water on trying to make this relationship between China and the rest of the world work strategically.
That, Mr. Hadley, is a very interesting glass door that Germany has yet to walk through, I think. Very good point. Let me shift to another region, the Middle East. Terrible stuff going on in Syria. Germany has a very close relationship with Israel. Anything that you would say Germany, because Europe on this issue is very difficult to get a consensus on, anything Germany should be doing that it's not?
Well, it's very difficult for an American to throw stones at Europe for not being able to get its act together on
Point well taken. Point well
on
taken.
the Middle East. Because, if you look at the divisions within the U.S. administration on this issue of do you arm the Syrian opposition or not, I think the United States political elite, at least the administration, within the administration, I think the political elite is much more in favor of arming and helping the opposition. But clearly there are real reservations and real discussions and divisions within the administration, as they have been in Europe. I think, though, this is a place where, again, European leadership could be very important. I mean, look, we saw it in Libya. We would have not done what was done in Libya if European leaders had not stepped forward and pushed the President of the United States.
With the exception of Germany. With the exception of Germany.
I'm going to get to that.
Okay.
So I think there is a role for Europe and the United States to be working more closely in terms of the Middle East. The issue for Germany, of course, is there's a colonial history for a UK or France in the Middle East that Germany does not share. Right. And again, my sense is that the proper role for Germany in many ways in this case is not to have a German position on the Middle East, but to be working within Europe so that there is a European position on the Middle East, and Europe as a whole can be a partner with the United States in dealing with these problems. I think that in a way it's this whole issue about the European experiments. I think at the moment in some ways Europe as qua Europe is less than the sum of its parts.
Good point.
And what we need is a Europe qua Europe that is greater than the sum of its parts. And that, I think, is really the role for Germany. Okay. And so in this case, if Germany could, within the EU, be active in developing a European position on what to do on some of these Middle East issues, I think it would be terrifically important. I would say another area, Africa. An area where the United States and Europe ought to be cooperating. Again, Germany has some colonial history in Africa, some knowledge of it. But again, I think it is not for the U.S. and Germany to be active in Africa. It is for the United States working with the EU, Europe as a whole, if you will, to be more active in the area, and again, not just commercially and economically,
but strategically,
but more strategically in helping the countries make the transitions to inclusive societies that have put their tribal histories behind them, that are investing in their people, that are providing services that are not corrupt. You know, there's a huge opportunity in Africa. As you know, 6 of the 10 fastest growing economies, admittedly from a low base, are in Africa. And Africans are waking up on the need for responsible government, but they have a lot of lack of capacity to provide good governance and services to their people. Well, you know, the Europeans know a lot about capacity building. That is an area where the United States and Europe ought to be working together to help these states make their transition to the point where they can provide security and prosperity and a better life for their people.
Yeah, it's an interesting point you make, because I think what you're talking really does play right into a German approach to Europe because of what you said before. Remember what I said, we're going to lead from behind or lead from the second row. Germany doesn't want to be pushed too far out in front of everyone else. They want to consolidate and drive consensus. This could be what you're getting at in terms of those 4 or 5 or 6 different areas in which they are operating. My sense is that that's the way they want to go. I think the question mark is going to be, can they develop a consensus within a Europe, which, as we talked about before, is still a little bit uncertain of itself as to where it's going. I mean, for example, this question about where are the borders of Europe? Does Turkey belong in there? Is that going to eventually backfire? I don't know the last time you were in Istanbul, but I think a lot of, or in Ankara, but I mean, a lot of people are saying that relationship is kind of going sour because of the fact that this is a 40-year negotiation and hasn't gone anywhere. What do you think of that in that particular case?
Well, I've been a big supporter historically of Turkey's inclusion in the EU.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's good for Turkey. Quite frankly, I think it's good for the EU. If you
Mm-hmm.
look at the dynamism of the Turkish economy, I was in Istanbul maybe 6 or 8 months ago, probably about a year ago, and I said I think the issue is not whether Turkey ought to join the EU, but given the economic disparity of how Turkey is doing and how the EU is doing, the issue is whether the EU ought to join Turkey, because Turkey's doing something right here.
Yeah.
And I think part of the evolution you see in Turkey is because I think a lot of Turks have come to the conclusion that Europe really doesn't want them. And what's even more dangerous is a lot of Turks have now decided actually they don't want Europe.
Mm.
And Turkey is an extremely important country, but I just think for the good of international stability more generally, over the longer term, I think a Turkey that is anchored in a relationship, and I'm using my words cautiously, in a strong relationship with the EU is better for Turkey, it's better for Europe, quite frankly, and it's better for that region because Turkey has a real role to play, I think, as an example of how a state that is Muslim in religious conviction among its population and has now a dominant political party which comes out of political Islam, mm-hmm. can actually help move a country in the direction of democracy and prosperity. In the last several years, a lot of us think Turkey's losing its way.
Yeah, well, certainly in the last few months, there's been, yeah.
And we've seen that crackdown very regrettably in the last several months. I think that's partly a fact that, Turkey is unsure and trying to find its way. Mm-hmm. And partly the reason it's having to find its way is because the path to affiliation with the EU looks blocked. Yeah. And I think it's a historic mistake.
Yeah. Well, we'll see what happens. So we have in Europe, the machinery in Brussels is going to be changing, and next year we'll have to see what kind of leadership emerges there on that issue. Let me ask you one final question, which kind of is a little bit of a conundrum. I'd be curious as to how you saw it. You saw it when you were in office. We were talking about the fact that Germany ought to push Europe to become more of a consensus-driven institution, that there ought to be an ability to make Europe congeal a bit more. What about if we were to give Germany, a Security Council seat in the UN. Would that help?
Well, again, you know, there are two things I would say in response to that question. One is, I would not say a more consensus-driven institution.
Okay.
I think I would say, look, is Europe on the road to being an entity that begins to speak in the international community with a single voice?
Mm-hmm.
That is the question. Is it going to become a single diplomatic actor? And obviously, given there will have to be some consensus after that, but I think the question really is, who's going to lead Europe?
Right.
Because in the end of the day, it's, you know, if it's by consensus, you're going to be the last of the party. You're not going to be leading from the second row. You're going to be leading from the third or the fourth row. So one of the questions is Europe still on the road of being aspiring to be largely a single international actor? And if so, who's going to lead that actor?
Mm-hmm.
Who is going to convince not just German leader convincing Germans, a French leader interpreting French, who is going to speak for and lead Europe as a whole in a direction on the international stage? I think that is the question that has not really been answered, and that's the question I think that needs to be answered.
In other words, it would be better to have a European seat in the Security Council.
It's exactly, because, you know, in some sense, to add a German seat,
Yeah.
you know, you're
adding fuel to the fire.
You're adding fuel to the fire,
Yeah.
and it's just like, you know, you go from the G7 to the G8 to the G20,
Right.
and the question is, so how many seats? And you have seats for both European countries, and then of course the Commission wants a seat.
Right.
So, you know, I think in some sense that's going what I would say is the wrong direction. The real question is, at what point do the Europeans decide they're going to have a single seat,
Mm-hmm.
and send the message to the world that that Europe is going to speak with a single voice?
Yeah.
That's really, I think, the more interesting question, rather than when is Germany going to get a seat on the Security Council, because, you know, we've been down that road.
Right.
What do you then tell the Italians?
Right.
Same thing. People say India should have a seat. Great. Then what do you tell the Pakistanis?
Or the Brazilians, for that matter.
Same thing.
Yeah, I think you're right on that. I mean, my sense is, though, that's a long passage you've just described.
That's a long
It's been
passage.
away. I mean, as I say before, 60 years is a blink of an eye in history, and how far they've come is pretty impressive. Now, they've got a long way to go. My sense is that 60 years was actually not, quite frankly, a product of this cataclysmic event of the 20th century.
Right.
We don't need to have a cataclysmic event to go further in Europe, but I guess the bottom line of our conversation here is that here in Washington, we have a vested interest in having that happen. And I guess our work here at the Institute is designed to shed light on that and to figure out where our vested interests are and how we push them forward. But I think that you also said something which gives me some pause, and that is that we can't just be observers here. We should be more engaged, right?
And I think that's an opportunity really for institutions such as yourself, which particularly doesn't have any political coloration,
Right.
to basically, in some sense, use some convening power within the think tank community and ask the question, why are we not spending more time paying attention to Europe, and not just the European role in specific things like Middle East peace, but the future evolution of Europe? And where is our expertise on that? And who is following, not just German relations, who is following the issue of what is happening within the EU, and what are the issues that are going to be determinative of the direction Europe takes, and providing some intellectual leadership on that issue. I think we're just not focusing. We are not investing in those questions any longer. We are not building up our intellectual capital. And therefore, when a new political administration is formed, I'm not sure there is a bench from which a new administration, Republican or Democrat, can draw from, who can really lead the U.S. government intelligently about the dialogue it should be having with Europe, not just about the Middle East or China or Africa, but the dialogue with Europe about wither Europe. Because that is an issue, I think, that America has an enormous stake in, because of how important Europe is going to be in the rest of this century.
And you just defined our mission. And we just had that conversation, which we will continue to have, and I hope you'll join us again sometime soon.
Pleasure.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.